The conversation hung. Ann Veronica wondered what her father would do if she were to tell him the full story of her relations with Ramage. "A man like that taints a girl by looking at her, by his mere conversation." He adjusted his glasses on his nose. There was another little thing he had to say. "One has to be so careful of one's friends and acquaintances," he remarked, by way of transition. "They mould one insensibly." His voice assumed an easy, detached tone. "I suppose, Vee, you don't see much of those Widgetts now?" "I go in and talk to Constance sometimes." "Do you?" "We were great friends at school." "No doubt. Still, I don't know whether I quite like something ramshackle about those people, Vee. While I am talking about your friends, I think you ought to know how I look at it." His voice conveyed studied moderation. "I don't mind, of course, your seeing her sometimes. Still there are differences in social atmospheres. One gets drawn into things. Before you know where you are, you find yourself in a complication. I don't want to influence you unduly, but they're artistic people, Vee. That's the fact about them. We're different." "I suppose we are," said Vee, rearranging the flowers in her hand. "Friendships that are all very well between schoolgirls don't always go on into later life. It's a social difference." "I like Constance very much." "No doubt. Still, one has to be reasonable. As you admitted to me, one has to square one's self with the world. You don't know. With people of that sort all sorts of things may happen. We don't want things to happen." Ann Veronica made no answer. A vague desire to justify himself ruffled her father. "I may seem unduly anxious. I can't forget about your sister. It's that has always made me she, you know, was drawn into a set. Didn't discriminate private theatricals." Ann Veronica remained anxious to hear more of her sister's story from her father's point of view, but he did not go on. Even so much allusion as this to that family shadow, she felt, was an immense recognition of her ripening years. She glanced at him. He stood a little anxious and fussy, bothered by the responsibility of her, entirely careless of what her life was or was likely to be, ignoring her thoughts and feelings, ignorant of every fact of importance in her life, explaining everything he could not understand in her as nonsense and perversity, concerned only with a terror of bothers and undesirable situations. "We don't want things to happen." Never had he shown his daughter so clearly that the womenkind he was persuaded he had to protect and control could please him in one way, and in one way only, and that was by doing nothing except the punctual domestic duties, and being nothing except restful appearances. He had quite enough to see to and worry about in the city without their doing things. He had no use for Ann Veronica. He had never had a use for her since she had been too old to sit upon his knee. Nothing but the constraint of social usage now linked him to her. And the less anything happened, the better. The less she lived, in fact, the better. These realizations rushed into Ann Veronica's mind and hardened her heart against him. She spoke slowly. "I may not see the Widgetts for some little time, father," she said. "I don't think I shall." "Some little tiff?" "No, but I don't think I shall see them." Suppose you were to add, "I'm going away." "I'm glad to hear you say it," said Mr. Stanley, and was so evidently pleased that Ann Veronica's heart smote her. "I am very glad to hear you say it," he repeated, and refrained from further inquiry. "I think we are growing sensible," he said. "I think you are getting to understand me better." He hesitated and walked away from her toward the house. Her eyes followed him. The curve of his shoulders, the very angle of his feet, expressed relief at her apparent obedience. "Thank goodness," said that retreating aspect. "That's said and over. Vee's all right. There's nothing happened at all." She didn't mean, he concluded, to give him any more trouble ever, and he was free to begin a fresh chromatic novel. He had just finished The Blue Lagoon, which he thought very beautiful and tender and absolutely irrelevant to Morningside Park. Or work in peace at his microtome without bothering her in the least. The immense disillusionment that awaited him. The devastating disillusionment. She had a vague desire to run after him, to state her case to him, to wring some understanding from him of what life was to her. She felt a cheat and a sneak to his unsuspecting retreating back. "But what can one do?" asked Ann Veronica. Part 3. She dressed carefully for dinner in a black dress that her father liked and that made her look serious and responsible. Dinner was quite uneventful. Her father read a draft prospectus warily, and her aunt dropped fragments of her projects for managing while the cook had a holiday. After dinner, Ann Veronica went into the drawing-room with Miss Stanley, and her father went up to his den for his pipe and pensive petrography. Later in the evening she heard him whistling, poor man. She felt very restless and excited. She refused coffee, though she knew that anyhow she was doomed to a sleepless night. She took up one of her father's novels and put it down again, fretted up to her own room for some work, sat on her bed, and meditated upon the room that she was now really abandoning forever, and returned at length with the stocking to darn. Her aunt was making herself cuffs out of little slips of insertion under the newly lit lamp. Ann Veronica sat down in the other armchair and darned badly for a minute or so. Then she looked at her aunt and traced with a curious eye the careful arrangement of her hair, her sharp nose, the little drooping lines of mouth and chin and cheek. Her thoughts spoke aloud. "Were you ever in love, aunt?" she asked. Her aunt glanced up, startled, and then sat very still, with hands that had ceased to work. "What makes you ask such a question, Vee?" she said. "I wondered." Her aunt answered in a low voice. "I was engaged to him, dear, for 7 years, and then he died." Ann Veronica made a sympathetic little murmur. "He was in holy orders, and we were to have been married when he got a living. He was a Wiltshire Edmondshaw, a very old family." She sat very still. Ann Veronica hesitated with a question that had leapt up in her mind, and that she felt was cruel. "Are you sorry you waited, aunt?" she said. Her aunt was a long time before she answered. "His stipend forbade it," she said, and seemed to fall into a train of thought. "It would have been rash and unwise," she said at the end of a meditation. "What he had was altogether insufficient." Ann Veronica looked at the mildly pensive gray eyes and the comfortable, rather refined face with a penetrating curiosity. Presently her aunt sighed deeply and looked at the clock. "Time for my patience," she said. She got up, put the neat cuffs she had made into her work-basket, and went to the bureau for the little cards in the morocco case. Ann Veronica jumped up to get her the card-table. "I haven't seen the new patients, dear," she said. "May I sit beside you?" "It's a very difficult one," said her aunt. "Perhaps you will help me shuffle." Ann Veronica did, and also assisted nimbly with the arrangements of the rows of 8 with which the struggle began. Then she sat watching the play, sometimes offering a helpful suggestion, sometimes letting her attention wander to the smoothly shining arms she had folded across her knees, just below the edge of the table. She was feeling extraordinarily well that night, so that the sense of her body was a deep delight, a realization of a gentle warmth and strength and elastic firmness. Then she glanced at the cards again, over which her aunt's many-ringed hand played, and then at the rather weak, rather plump face that surveyed its operations. It came to Ann Veronica that life was wonderful beyond measure. It seemed incredible that she and her aunt were indeed creatures of the same blood, only by a birth or so different beings, and part of that same broad interlacing stream of human life that has invented the fauns and nymphs, Astarte, Aphrodite, Freya, and all the twining beauty of the gods. The love songs of all the ages were singing in her blood. The scent of